신청하신 분 몇 분이 안 오셔가지고 조금 짧게 계시면 제가 소개해드리겠습니다. 안녕하세요. 인사드리겠습니다. 저는 융합대학원에 근무하고 있는 최동순이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 제가 사실은 2002년도에 환경공학부에 제가 근무를 했었습니다. 그래서 환경공학부에 대한 애정이 좀 있고요. 또 오늘 특별히 또 환경공학부의 권서인 교수님께서 세미나를 이렇게 승인을 해주셔서 기분 좋게 생각합니다. 제가 2002년도에 이제 환경공학부에 근무했는데 그때 장윤석 교수님, 황석한 교수님, 최원인 교수님, 이기태 교수님 그런 교수님들 같이 있었고요. 지금은 이제 그 이후에 여러분들이 많이 이제 들어오신 걸 알고 있는데 오늘 권서인 교수님 모시게 돼서 기쁘게 생각합니다. 저희가 융합대학원 런치타임 세미나로 해서 이제 작년에 이제 저희가 융합대학원을 설립을 해서 지금 올 3월부터 해서 죄송합니다. 3월부터 해서 세미나를 지금 이제 계속 개최를 하고 있는데 아시는 분도 아시겠지만 이제 3월하고 4월은 저희가 매주 월, 화, 수, 목 이렇게 했고요. 5월부터는 이제 매주 화요일을 이제 런치타임 세미나를 지정을 해서 운영을 지금 하고 있습니다. 지금 아마 이제 권 교수님이 아마 세미나를 하면 54번째 이제 순서가 될 것 같은데 좀 세미나를 이제 잘 해주시리라고 믿고 점심시간에 이렇게 좀 쉬셔야 되는데 시간을 내서 이렇게 오신 만큼 유익한 시간이 되시기를 바라겠습니다. 예, 들어오십니다. 네, 그럼 우리 환경공학부의 권세인 교수님을 모시고 유익한 세미나를 듣는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 교수님에게 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 환경공학부 조계수 권세인입니다. 제가 사실 오늘 발표는 영어로 할 거예요. 그 이유는 제가 여기서 생활을 되게 오래 해서 이제 한 중1 정도 나와서 이제 여기 부임되기 바로 전에 제가 들어왔거든요. 그래서 아직까지 한국말로 이제 수다는 되게 잘 떠는데 이 발표를 하는 것이 좀 많이 부족한 부분이 있어서 그리고 외국인 친구들 와 있고 해서 이제 제가 영어로 발표를 드릴 계획이고 질문 같은 경우는 편하게 그냥 한국말로 하셔도 됩니다. 중간중간 슬라이드도 한국어로 되어 있는 것도 몇 가지 있긴 하고요. 그래서 일단은 갑자기 항상 이렇게 한국말 잘하다가 영어로 하면 되게 배신감 많이 느끼실 텐데 좀 양해 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다. Okay, so the title of this talk, 항상 이 회전이 좀 너무 많이 어색해서 웃음이 많이 나는데, 네, okay. Anyways, the title of this talk is on environmental forensics, the provocative science of investigation. So essentially, I want to go over two main things during this presentation today. One is what makes environmental forensics really provocative, right? So that's the first thing that I want to talk about. The second thing is what makes this discipline of science really a solid investigation, right? So we'll really focus on these two aspects, the provocativeness as well as the investigation. But before moving further, I want to give you a brief history of our awareness for environmental science conservation effort as well as protection. So essentially, as with many other countries in the world, right, our awareness for this environmental protection and conservation began relatively recently in the mid 1970s, right? But before that, all we really cared about was industrialization and as well as economic development. And there was the first environmental legislation that was enacted in 1963, but it was really just simply symbolic. It had no role in the real protection of the environment. It was just there to represent, that we have a piece of legislation reflecting an environment. But after starting basically 1970s, as well as during the course of 20 years, there was a lot of increasement in the infrastructure as well as legal legislations regarding the environment, as well as various aspects of the environment, as you can see on the atmosphere and the water and things like that, right? This is sort of in the past, but I'm sure you guys are more aware of more recent terminologies that are being used to reflect our effort for environmental science, right? So those are really focused on this term sustainability. So this really increased with the globalization, right? So the globalization is increasing and we're starting to adopt a lot of terminologies that are reflecting our multilateral effort, right? There's like UN conservation effort and conventions that are associated with environmental protection. So we're adopting a lot of these terminologies such as sustainability. And now apparently we're in the era of survivability. I really don't know who comes up with these terminologies, but it sounds really dire. And this is not something that I came up with, obviously. It's sort of shifting in that gear, as you can see. So before we used to be in the era of sustainability. Now with a lot of global warming events and figuring out where to deposit our waste, we're sort of in a more or less dire situation. The point that I want to make here, though, we're going to go back a little bit and see what the hell really happened in the mid 1975, right? So what really began here, what initiated a lot of these implementation of infrastructure and legislation is beginning of environmental research as well as activism. So activism is really voicing out, the importance of environment, as well as research is really what's driving us to care about the environment, right? And that, marking of that movement is really reflected in a lot of these articles and books and journals, and they're very closely tied with our political development as well. So increasing liberalization and democratization is closely linked with essentially our need to protect the environment. So I brought a quote from one of the book called Poison Prosperity. And the quote goes like this. So there has been a perceptible change in Korea's national political culture in 1975, which is really the initiation of that environmental research. The highly respected Professor Kwan at Yonsei University published a short scientific paper detailing the level of industrial air pollution. And since then, he essentially was interrogated. It was sort of seen as a threat to the national economy. But with ongoing research and activism, really voicing out the importance of environment, essentially the environmental issue itself has become an important measure of the progress of liberalization and political modernization. The point that I want to make here is two things. Essentially, the first thing is science is always, an important initiation for us to voice out the importance of the environment. In the case of Korea, obviously, the activism came along with the association with this environmental issue being a part of a political agenda, right? So it really sparked quickly in terms of, implementing legislation as well as infrastructure. The other point that I want to make is this highly respected Professor Kwan happens to be my grandfather. So I didn't really know he was an environmental scientist, even before college. I was already in the field of environmental science. He was always just a nice grandpa for me. But I've found out, luckily before he passed away, that he has been the first environmental activist. He started the first environmental research center at Yonsei University. So he's been working a lot on this field, and I think that happens to run in my legacy. I'll show you what other legacies that I've adopted in the future, but essentially the similar movement has been happening all around the world. And probably one of the most influential person when it comes to this environmental movement in the United States is Rachel Carson. She is a biologist and ecologist who wrote a book called Silent Spring. And it was mostly on the book on reporting and detailing how the use of pesticides, so widespread utilization of pesticide with a lot of these agricultural industrialization that is happening has threatened our ecosystem as well as our wildlife, right? So again, similar movement these activism and movement being initiated from a lot of scientific books and observational studies. What's slightly different though compared to Korea is that, as I mentioned, our need for environmental protection is closely associated with our political agenda, right? But in the United States, it seems like a lot of it is really linked with the need for, health right, need for justice, essentially, right? So a lot of these movements are, okay, we want to identify who is responsible for this contamination. We want to identify the responsible party and be able to make justice along with it, right? So that's really what initiated and allowed environmental forensics to be disseminated in the United States compared to in Korea. So one of the most classic example of environmental forensics is it comes from a woman called Erin Brockovich. So she's not really a scientist, but she was feisty. Basically, she built a really good legal case, really strong legal case regarding this groundwater contamination through hexavalent chromium, which is known to be extremely toxic, right? And hexavalent chromium was used as anti-corrosive agent, and this gas company eventually got sued. And a lot of these evidences, very classical evidences came from chromium isotopes as a main forensics tool. And what's really interesting also is that this was such a big case and really the start of modern environmental activism as well as forensic studies that it was filmed in a movie by Julia Roberts. So it was really, sensational, and it's really marking a lot of these tools that are now being utilized for identifying the responsible parties. The other point that I want to make is what we're trying to do. So I'm trying to now identify myself as an environmental forensics investigator, right? I just want to say that what we're trying to do here is really not that much different from criminal forensics, right? So we're more aware of this discipline of criminal forensics where they do a lot of scientific investigations to identify who may be responsible for this crime activity or whatnot, right? So, a lot of overlapping ideas and tools that are being utilized in these two different disciplines. One, obviously, everything's driven based on the evidence, so it's very evidence-based, scientifically driven, and maybe we need sunglasses, but it's not mandatory. But essentially, taking that legacy upon, I'm also trying to, follow not just my grandpa's legacy, but also follow this woman's legacy of trying to essentially, identify myself as an environmental forensics investigator, trying to build cases using my own tool, which is called mercury stable isotopes. So I'll probably spend only a little bit of time talking about the actual mercury stable isotopes, but here I'll mostly focus on what this, environmental forensics discipline is all about. So yet again, as I mentioned, These are the main topics that I'll be discussing. What makes environmental forensics really provocative? What makes it a scientific investigation? But before, I'll quickly go over the definition of environmental forensics, right? We've been talking a lot about, it's similar to criminal forensics and whatnot, but what is a pure definition of it, right? So environmental forensics is defined as a systematic scientific evaluation of physical, chemical, and historical information to develop defensible scientific and legal conclusions on the source and the age of contamination. So essentially, we're trying to use scientific basis to develop legal conclusions, right? We're going to try to sue someone here, essentially. But in order to do that, well, two things that we have to understand is where is contamination coming from, right? That's referring to the source. And age is when did this contamination happen, right? Is it still ongoing? Did it happen, decades ago? All that information is going to be very valuable for us developing a case against some sort of responsible party. The origin of environmental forensics essentially happened in the late 1980s, so very recently, right? With this oil exploration and spill incidences that began to happen across the United States. So, I mean, oil incidents are really blatantly obvious. There's a ship, there's oil, there's not much forensics that needs to go on here, but that's where a lot of these isotope techniques came from and has been derived. And that really marked another really important event for environmental forensics. The motivation of environmental forensics is really driven by early national and international laws. So the origin itself comes from a lot of these legal frameworks, right? That's what makes this field really strong and in a way very applicable, right? What we're trying to do in the field, identify source, responsible party, is going to be implemented, whether that's shutting down an industry or whatever, right? So it's very sensitive topic in a way. That itself also makes it really provocative. There's something called environmental forensics quartet. So essentially all the questions that we ask when we're doing science are driven by these 4 words, right? So what, where, when, and who. So what is the source of contamination? Where is it coming from? When did it happen? Who did it, basically, right? So all these things are driven by what allows us to drive our science. Key elements of environmental forensics: you have to characterize the site and source of contamination using your scientific tool. Historical reconstruction, again, it could be something really recent, it could be something that has collapsed, doesn't matter. We want to identify when the contamination has happened. And this one is a really sensitive one, right? Allocation of liability of releases as well as harm, right? So we kind of have to see this in 2 splits, right? So who is responsible for the release of contamination? Release is one thing, harm is another thing, right? You can release something, but it's maybe not harmful, right? Then it's a less of an issue, obviously, because it's not linked with public health. But we also want to identify the allocation of responsibility for the harm, right? What is the toxicity, the toxic events? What are the exposure routes, right? All these things have to come along, making this field potentially really sensitive and provocative. Interdisciplinary, obviously not really making anything provocative, but very interesting, right? We're using chemical, physical information, geological information, especially when we're reconstructing the history, legal, regulatory, and potentially eco and toxicological. So eco is ecosystem toxicology. Toxicology itself is more driven by public health. All the things that I've highlighted in red here are what makes it really provocative. It's felt very unapproachable at the moment in Korea, right? In the United States, there are a lot of legal frameworks, which I will introduce here today, but essentially with the absence of any type of legal or regulatory framework, having this sort of scientific discipline being motivated by the national and international laws, making legal conclusions. So what can actually be used as legal conclusion, right? So what kind of scientific information is going to be used to support or suppress some sort of legal activity? Allocation, again, as I mentioned, liability of harm is going to be difficult. The other aspects that make it really provocative is that it can, whatever outcome of what we do in science, right? is going to lead to potentially to industrial shutdown and loss of job. And that is definitely economically seen not a very good thing. So we have to take it really seriously, right? And I want to, eventually turn it around, make it a little bit more approachable, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. A very vague idea. Anyways, so in the, let's look at the case of the United States. What makes it really, easy to conduct this environmental forensics in the United States, right? So as with a lot of countries, US have their lists of their legislations and laws, right? And they're mostly referred to as US code, right? So you have like multiple codes related to different disciplines, and they're referring to this United States law, right? There's a code, Title 42, called the Public Health and Welfare. And in this title of the code, they have 161 chapters related to environmental, energy, and human health policies. So they're all, all these chapters are referring to different things regarding the environment, the energy, and human health. And they have so many different things. It was so interesting, like air pollution control devices, water resources, insurance for natural disasters, human health rights, renewable energy development. I mean, all sorts of things, right? But one of the chapter that it covers here, chapter 103, is called Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. Really important piece of law for environmental forensics. This, we call it CERCLA. So it's something that we learn in like environmental science 101. It's like the most important piece of legislation when it comes to environmental studies. But it was enacted in December 1980s along with the first movement of environmental forensics, right? So a lot of oil spill accidents, and then we are sort of, the federal government, the authorities are identifying that it is really important to, allocate some sort of responsibility. We're not going to use our taxes to clean this up, right? We're going to make someone clean it up. So gotta have a law for it, which is a really smart move. But essentially in this chapter, they're saying federal authority needs to respond to hazardous sites by doing all sorts of activities. And these activities are also really well guided and well defined in a way. It is relatively flexible. You can do a lot of different type of science to come up with legal conclusions, right? But it gives some sort of guideline for the scientists as well as federal authorities to work on, right? So here, so interesting, right? It starts with preliminary assessment of site inspection. So simply, please go to the site and see like where and like how much it's contaminated, just having a quick site survey, understanding the site. So it's very scientifically driven. Again, it's not like coming from some sort of observation. And then they're gonna go through a national priority list, site listing process. Essentially, if it's really contaminated, we are going to enlist the site as hazardous site where the federal government is going to take care of it, or make someone take care of it. If it's not that contaminated, then no, we're not going to deal with this, right? So they're going to categorize that. Afterwards, remedial investigation feasibility study. They're not just simply going to make someone pay for remediation. They're going to try to identify, does this site really need some sort of remediation, right? Or is it as simple as, removing a source? Or is it going to be a really widespread cleanup activity? So they're going to do a preliminary survey on that as well. And then records of decision. So they're going to decide whether remedy needs or need not, right? And then the other part is remedial design, remedial action. So all these scientists and engineers are going to go in and try to determine what the best remedial design is going to be. So again, very scientifically driven. And it's very site by site decision. There's no like guideline to say like, you have to use these type of approaches to remediate this place, right? It can be anything, right? And then construction completion, whatever. But at the end, there is site reuse and redevelopment. So they're going to try to reuse the site as much as possible, recover it into a recreational park or whatever, right? So there's a lot of activities that are being happening in the United States. This is essentially the program that is being has been ran since 1980s, but they've sort of utilized a different term, right? So the federal authority in this case, obviously, is the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the program that they're running, all these scientific and engineering activity that are being done is called Superfund program. Superfund, fund, they're trying to gather funds. The reason that we're doing the science is because again, the country's not paying for it. We want to find the responsible party, gather enough super fund so we can clean it up, right? So that's where a lot of this terminology has been initiated. So we call this entire program Superfund program, and then hazardous sites are called Superfund sites. So if you talk to anyone in the US who studies environmental science, we don't really say contaminated site, hazardous site. We call it a Superfund site, right? And then there's a mapping that's been going on here across the United States. And the greens are the ones that are remediated. The yellows are ongoing process. The red ones are sort of trying to decide whether they should be enlisted or not. But they're doing this national-wide survey, recording essentially everything, allowing the public to see, in nearby, like my living area, is there any Superfund site, right? I think this is something that we should definitely do. Yeah, I'm really excited. My students are like, no way. But anyways, here, and they deal with a lot of the different types of media here. So like landfill mines, like abandoned mines, they remediate soil, lake, river, water, sediment, groundwater. There is no restriction on what type of environmental media that we should care about. It's just the entire site that has been contaminated. So it's very comprehensive, very scientific. I really like it. Let's go to Korea. So, I'm not like, yay, US, it's like, I'm just saying, just as a comparison, but essentially, so what are similar pieces of legislations that are available in Korea, right? So these are all the legislations that are related to the environment. This is it. I mean, it's great. So just to look at one thing at a time. The first one, the most comprehensive piece of legislation on the environment is 환경정책기본법, right? Just the most comprehensive, the broad one, right? Here, they actually have a chapter on finding source of contamination or identify who may be responsible for contamination, but it's very vague. There are no additions, footnotes, anything related to this, but essentially they're saying, if you've contaminated this place, we want it back. So recovery and remediation, right? But there's no guideline as to, or scientific procedures or guidelines to for authorities to follow. And in this case, our authority would be 환경부, right? Similar to EPA, right? So the people in 환경부 doesn't really know how to react or respond to these contaminated sites. So that's one issue. And then, of all these laws, related to the atmosphere, the water, the waste, sludges, or whatever, there's only one media or area that targets this environmental forensics, and that's soil, right? So soil here, one of them says soil is contaminated, you have, the responsibility to remediate. So who is this responsible party? And they try to define this, and then it's like, I don't know, whatever who has released the contamination, and then like if you owe this land, right? Obviously, you are responsible for cleaning, and then if you inherited this land from your mom or dad or whatever, then you're also responsible for remediation and treatment, right? But if you bought this land or if you have inherited this before 1996, then you're off the hook, because the law was only developed in 1996. So it's a really recent law. Environmental law covering soil it started only 1996. I mean, I don't know, I'm old, so it feels like really recent, but maybe some of you are born that day. So it's all relative, I guess. And then the other thing is the contamination, you have to remediate it. And there are like a couple of guidelines, right? But it's really broad. The one is like you have to like remediate it by whatever the president said. I don't know, 정화 기준은 정화 방법에 따라 정화해야 한다. I don't know what that particular method is, right? But whatever it is, we have to follow that guideline. It's not site by site approach. It's something that has been designated. The other one is you have to allow other, I don't know, companies to remediate it. I don't know what the background of all this regulation is all about, right? And you have to do it on site. You can't like scoop it out and do it somewhere else. You have to do it here, right? So all these restrictions are essentially suppressing our ability to conduct science. And we're really restricted with, you know, the type of media that we're dealing with as well. What in addition to that, right? So what like our country is covering is essentially very limited issues, topics, and media, right? There are a lot of, we're in the era of survivability, apparently the government says, right? And you know, there are many other environmental issues and medias that we need to cover. We have a lot of atmospheric issues coming from potentially China, you know, drinking water issues, and a lot of contamination issues regarding the sediment, right? Sediment is, I'll get into that, but you know, 낙동강 성포 재련소 토암치 형상강. This is, you know, a contamination issue that is happening in our own country at the moment, or in our own local environment, right? And then marine sediments as well. What makes it really difficult, right? So when it comes to soil, it's something people own, right? It's a very financially driven property. You sell the soil, you sell the piece of land, you buy the piece of land. So it becomes a little bit more sensitive in terms of identifying who may be responsible. Whereas the sediment, by definition, is just some particulate matter that is carried by water or wind and that deposited in the surface, right? So no one really owns the sediment. It's something that blew off and ran off into the water, right? So who's gonna own this, you know, sediment? Why do we need some sort of, you know, identification of responsible parties to pay for it? And then the whole this conflict between, is the sediment in like the freshwater, because that's going to be 국립환경과학원. If it's in the marine environment, coastal environment, then it's like owned by 해양수산과학기술부. So there's like a territorial issues that really makes it, again, additionally difficult for us to identify who may be responsible. So just to quickly summarize, so what makes it really provocative? You know, we're dealing with diverse environmental and potentially health issues to allocate responsibility and seek justice to prevent further pollution. So essentially, we have to be able to be more comprehensive in terms of dealing with the scope of environmental issues, health issues, and to essentially prevent ongoing pollution. If nobody's responsible, this is going to essentially continue in our environment. When the consequences of our action can lead to industrial shutdown and loss of job, a consequence as in our action as in our scientific effort, there are no legal framework or scientific procedures to assess, identify, remediate, and also allow industries to defend themselves, right? So while we're the one building scientific cases against the industries also need to be aware of these regulations and procedures for them to defend themselves in the case that they are really truly not responsible for contamination. So there are no measures on both sides to be able to resolve this issue in the long run. And the table essentially summarizes the main difference between how the US and Korea is reacting to these contaminated sites, right? The authority site characterization is very scientifically driven in the United States, whereas we're following some sort of guideline, some sort of level. If it exceeds like whatever amount of concentration, maybe we should consider remediating it. And then it's like who, right? Most often I think we pay for it. Remedial approach, site-by-site approach, right? Here it's very restrictive, whatever that list is. The media, encompassing all types of media, soil only. The goal is really driven by for human health, whereas a lot of the soil legislations are really about resolving these financial disputes. So that's what makes it provocative, a little bit unapproachable in a realistic way, but also the fact that it's coming from the fact that it's originated from these legal issues itself makes it really provocative and difficult and sensitive. The other topic that I'm going to talk about again is the environmental forensics, what makes it a scientific investigation, right? Why am I keep saying this is science? Are we like, I feel like I'm here to sell something, but I'm definitely not selling anything. But what makes it really science, right? So let's talk about that. So here, everything that we do is similar to the method of science, right? We're trying to develop hypothesis, build scenarios of how, when, there's no how, sorry, what, where, when, who contaminated this environment. How is also actually very, very important. But, we're building, multiple routes. Where is the source? If this is a source, how did it get released into that environment? How did it cause toxic effect? If this is not it, if it's another source, then how did that contaminate our environment? We're building all these hypotheses and scenarios, and we're trying to use scientific tools to test this. Very important to verify the responsible party, but also to eliminate, right? Again, very sensitive. We have to be able to eliminate who may not be responsible for contamination. So that's, we're doing a lot of that with science. A lot of the traditional tools that have been utilized here is, under the category of environmental forensics is, aerial photography, biochemical analysis, age reconstruction using isotope dating methods, isotopic analysis. A lot of, we hear this word fingerprinting, using isotope ratios. So that's a lot of what we do, statistical methods and contaminant modeling, right? So these are traditional tools. It has been used widely, for not just environmental forensics, but for any multiple other purposes. Something that I want to say is that there's a lot of room for development of each of these techniques too, the scientific approaches, right? So right now, based on the textbook on environmental forensics, we're heading to a new direction where this is sort of the classical tools that have been used, but we're sort of moving into more like portable sensor technology to get a better resolution on the time, duration, frequency of releases. Again, is it still ongoing? Then by what magnitude, how frequently is it happening, right? All that very high resolution information is necessary for being able to verify and eliminate the responsible parties. Also, each of these techniques definitely need more improvement, right? Aerial photography, now we can use drones, right? Instrumentations, improvements in our instrumentations, method development to better purify our samples to get a better accuracy on the results. So all these things have to essentially go hand in hand. So under this really large
44년 11월
hello? Am I talking? Okay. Okay. Let me know if you have questions. For now, just a lot of engineering and scientific developments are necessary under this really large umbrella of environmental forensics, whether it's a technique development, method development, or just our approach of doing environmental forensics. Just to quickly go through the tool that I'm using. So my expertise is in mercury stable isotopes. So I did mention, stable isotopes are being utilized for fingerprinting here, right? So identifying what that source of contamination may be. The reason that we've been able to use this so effectively in this contaminated environment, there are multiple reasons, but the most important thing is all different environmental samples and the source of emissions or releases have very distinct mercury stable isotope ratios. So one of the example here that I can utilize is precipitation that is impacted by coal-fired power plant have very negative value compared to those that are unimpacted by coal-fired power plant. So clean precipitation versus those impacted by industry obviously have very different ratios. So we can measure that and utilize to identify this has been affected by what source, right? Maybe not what company yet, right? But at least what source is impacting the contamination. And then, we could do a lot of, the multi-dimensional aspect that comes from is, traditionally, this is like a sediment core. It has been dated using lead isotopes. So isotope is being used a lot for environmental forensics. But essentially, we used to get this one-dimensional.
항공모함으로 바뀌는 작업을 진행했고 1944년 11월에 새 항공모함이 거의 완성되게 됩니다. 우여곡절 끝에 완성된 이 항공모함이 바로 시라노인데요. 도쿄만에서 시험 항해를 하는 모습이 일본인 민간 작가에 의해 찍히고 있습니다.
I think
1, 2번 함과 똑같이 6만 5천 튜브이고 일본이 이베를 건조할 때 비밀 유지를 하도 심하게 해서 20세기에 건조된 군함들 중 유일하게 건조 당시의 사진이 남아있지 않은 배.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll just shut this off. But another dimension that is ongoing, obviously, it's not just a level that spiked, right? So again, you can identify when the contamination happened here, because obviously the core has been dated with lead isotopes, right? You can see the increases in mercury level, but here, by using isotope, we can also identify what that source may be. What is the source that is causing this peak in mercury concentration, right? So that's another dimension that we can gather from this, this amazing tool. Another thing that we, the reason that we use mercury stable isotope is because it also gives us perspectives on biogeochemical processes. So a lot of these isotopes don't necessarily undergo changes in the environment. So once they're introduced into the environment, they are well preserved. That's sort of unlike for mercury isotopes. They can undergo fractionation. What's known as fractionation is essentially them, changing in their abundances depending on various type of chemical and biogeochemical processes. So these are just a few of the examples on what kind of processes are changing the isotope signature of mercury. But essentially, you don't only gather information on the source, but you can also understand the cycling process before it led to some sort of contamination. Just brief things. The case study that I want to sort of introduce to make my point a little bit more clear on what makes it a scientific investigation actually is happening right here in the city of Pohang. So I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not, but there has been this ongoing mercury contamination issue in Gyeongsan River in Pohang, and this initially happened in 2016, right? And it's something that we are trying to tackle using mercury stable isotopes to identify which may be the responsible source or party for contamination. But essentially, here, the site is really complex, right? So we're somewhere here, really bad with geography, but anyways. So essentially, we know that this Gyeongsan River is the one that is really contaminated, right? And there's a lot of fisheries production, especially like shellfish, tetop, right? And we distribute that in all over the country, right? But we, for now, we found that this Kumu Creek, Kumucheon, is a really tiny, tiny creek. It's an artificial creek, but that's the source that's leading to this entire Gyeongsan River contamination. So we know all the mercury is coming out of this Kumu Creek, right? So what makes Kumu Creek really difficult to study, right? So this is a zoomed up version of Kumu Creek, but essentially there are 160 industries along Kumu Creek. So that makes it really difficult to pinpoint the source of contamination. Also, there is a hazardous waste landfill site at the upstream of Kumu Creek. So that's where the creek starts. But this is a hazardous waste landfill. We're not talking about municipal waste landfill, but essentially this entire landfill collapsed in 1994, back in the old day, and everything essentially went into Kumu Creek. So, but we're now discovering that this is really contaminated, right? So that's something that happened a long time ago. So obviously requiring historical reconstruction, right? Too many industries, and then we also have POSCO, right? Really nearby, something that we can't really close our eyes off of. But essentially, here, this is our scenario building or hypothesis building, right? We want to know what may be responsible for contamination. So let's say these type of small industries are responsible for mercury contamination, then these are the questions that we should be asking. So are there any industries that use mercury during their manufacturing processes, right? So we have to survey that. Also, if they are using mercury, is mercury coming out through wastewater treatment facilities? Is it a release process, right? That's a pathway of contamination. Also, is it coming through a particulate phase or dissolved phase? how are they being transported into this environment? So we're doing scientific investigation to either confirm or eliminate these things. The other questions that we have to ask, if POSCO was responsible for contamination, is the source through atmospheric emissions. So it's no longer released. Something is being emitted into the atmosphere. And is it being deposited through dry deposition or wet deposition? That's something that we have to ask, And apparently, POSCO has like hundreds of coal-fired power plants within them, and that happens to be one of the main source of mercury emissions as well, right? So it's something that we can't ignore. We at least have to eliminate this possibility. The other thing is, let's say if it's a hazardous waste landfill that collapsed in 1994, right? So is the collapse a source of contamination? If it is, then, did the hazardous waste landfill have any mercury added products or related sludges within them? Something to confirm. And how heterogeneous is the contamination? If it's something like a landslide, obviously, we will see a very heterogeneous distribution of mercury rather than a very, distance-related trend. And age dating is something that is also necessary, right? So hypothesis building, scenario building, and then trying to track our way back to using scientific information to understand, the process and source of contamination. This is something definitely ongoing. Obviously the city of Pohang is really interested in allocating liability. All they care about is identifying who contaminated. They want to try to gather the fund to pay for the cleanup, right? Obviously the city of Pohang does not want to use their own taxes to clean this up, right? So that's becoming very sensitive, and that's what I've been mostly associated with in terms of doing my science with city of Pohang. The Ministry of Environment, more or less, interested in understanding the transport risk assessment, but mostly they want to implement sediment guidelines. They're finally realizing that in addition to soil, sediment contamination may be important because we are finding a lot of issues linked with sediment contamination, in these freshwater systems, but also in the marine systems, and the government cannot no longer pay for all these remedial activities, right? So there's been a lot of effort from the Ministry of Environment to develop sediment guidelines, regulations to identify responsible parties. So that's a really good news. I'll just move this, given the time. But obviously, what we do with mercury isotope is not just source contamination. That actually really began here with a lot of contamination issues in this country. But prior to that, I did mostly my work on geosciences, like in a really clean environment, studying like ocean cycle of mercury, like in the, in the natural environment, all these things. But, the importance of this tool is obviously growing really rapidly. We have what's known as the Minamata Convention on Mercury. It's a multilateral convention or agreement to mitigate anthropogenic mercury releases by the UN. So it's a really important piece of convention, and that governs a lot of different things, a lot of the scientific activities that we're doing. So contaminated site is associated with as one of the articles in the Minamata Convention on Mercury. We also have articles on research, development, and monitoring, effectiveness evaluation. So one of the things that we've been doing is gathering this isotopic information as a compiled data to allow other countries to also identify the source of contamination, but also evaluate how effective this convention may be in the long run, right? So over the course of the convention, so time since the convention has been implemented, over time we expect a lot of mercury to go down in the environment, right? What we have to know is that is this reduction pattern really caused by convention? And to test this, we have to be able to use mercury isotopes because the concentration information will not tell us what's causing that reduction. We're doing a lot of effort on that. Just give me a little more time. So we're ending almost to the end, right? Opportunities and challenges for environmental forensics in this country, right? So many opportunities when there's like nothing. It's like starting from a blank page, right? Which is really exciting. But so as a first step, what we did was we built what's called Center for Environmental Forensics. in our department, right? So we officially, for the first time in this country, have a center designated for environmental forensics. This was a really big deal. We did, we're like, oh, let's do the whole ribbon cutting and stuff like that. I imagine something very like elegant, but it did not happen that way. It was more like this. It was just a piece of paper that we cut with a scissor. And it was really exciting still. And the other thing that we did was one of my students not here today, probably knew this was going to happen. He like made a sketch for me, sort of as a gift, right? It said, this is like photoshopped face of mine and his face, but he said like, welcome to the new world, right? So we're opening this new world into the world of environmental forensics. It's obviously very exciting for my students and myself, because all we do is identify ourselves in terms of what we're doing in science, right? But what I want to emphasize is what we're trying to achieve and do is really not new, right? It's not a revolutionary, discipline, or we're not gonna all of a sudden develop something, right? The most important thing is we're going to utilize what has been available for us, but we're going to use it more effectively by building these regulations and guidelines, scientific procedures, supporting these legal framework to be in place in Korea, right? So hoping this is a really bottom-up approach, like starting from like 3 to, I don't know, across the nation. So, but it's okay, I'm still young, so I have a lot of time. But some opportunities and big vision that I have with the center, right? Trying to make environmental forensics as approachable as possible. Just because it's linked with industrial shutdown and legal basis, it doesn't mean that no one can be associated with this type of discipline, right? We're trying to make it, approachable by framing this discipline really nicely, right? We didn't have this term, and before we were just doing whatever we were doing science, right? Trying to identify source of contamination. All of a sudden, we just bring up this term environmental forensics, and everyone's like, no, that's not what we're doing. But you've been doing that for 20 years, but whatever. So we're trying to frame it, make it really approachable better, and increase awareness that this type of discipline does exist in our nation. Trying to broaden the scope of what we do, right? So we're not just gonna shut down an industry. That's not what we're trying to do. We want to understand the issues on transboundary transport of contamination, whether through the atmosphere or ocean circulation, identifying signals and noises, right? So here, the signal could be like policy relevant signal, noise could be climate change, right? Is this contamination reoccurring because of changes in the climate, right? Maybe there's a re-emission or things like that. Trying to evaluate the policy under the scope of environmental forensics as well. Again, being more involved in development as well. So identifying better tools, approaches for source tracing, trying to be more collaborative. We used to, that's what scientists do. We really focus on our little tool and we want to, play with it forever. But, trying to sort of share our knowledge and work collaboratively. Challenges, no legal scientific framework in place. That's going to be the most difficult one. So a lot of what we do is not being supported by the government or federal authorities at all. But first, I think it's really important that to identify what kind of scientific evidence can be used in court. And then we sort of have to trace back from there. I promised last slide. In the US, there is a whole list of the guidelines on like what kind of scientific information you can use in the court, right? So there's rules applying to the proceedings in the United States court, and the rule, they have so many rules here too, as you can see. The rule on 702 testimony by expert witness is on, you have to use sufficient facts and data, reliable principle and methods. And then they really, go on and define what that reliability and sufficiency mean, right? And reliability, experts' theory and technique has been tested, has been peer reviewed, which is good. That's what we do. We write papers, right? Potential rate of error. Are we using standard operating procedure? General acceptance of that technique in the scientific community. So if all these things are qualified, then we will let you use it in the court, right? Which to me feels quite reasonable, right? Broad enough, but also following all the necessary steps to say that this is a valid science. We didn't just develop something and brought it to the court, right? So I think a lot of this type of effort has to start in order to really push our effort for environmental forensics in this country, and that's what we're hoping to do in a fun way. So that's my presentation for today. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry that this was in English. It made my life so much easier. But if you have any questions, email me, and thank you.
질문 혹시 있으시면 묻겠습니다. Professor, take a question.
네, 한국말로 질문하셔도 돼요.
네, 질문은 한국말로 하시면 된답니다. 혹시 질문하실 분 안 계세요?
질문이 괜찮습니다.
교수님이 영어로 하셨는데 완벽하게 이해를 하신 것 같습니다. 너무 잘하셨습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 교수님 잠깐만. 저희 교수님 수고하셨는데요. 저희가 영합대학원에서 간단한 기념품을 좀 준비했습니다. 큰 박수 좀 부탁드리겠습니다. 이건 와인이고요. 네.
네,
먹을 컵입니다.
네,
감사합니다. 고맙습니다. 저희가 이제 세미나를 이렇게 다양하게 하고 있는데 아마 영어로 하는 세미나는 지금 이제 권성희 교수님 처음인 것 같고요. 저는 개인적으로 한글은 좀 이렇게 좀 알아듣기는 영어는 잘 이해가 안 됐습니다. 예, 참석하신 분들께서 다 잘 이해했으리라 생각이 되고요. 교수님 마지막에 말씀하셨지만 교수님 연구와 또 이렇게 관련된 내용에 대해서 궁금하신 사항이 있으시면 교수님한테 연락해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 오늘 이렇게 많이 참석해 주셔서 감사드리고요. 네, 조심해서 돌아가십시오. 네, 감사합니다. 감사합니다.